Hello knitters, Barbara Benson here. I'm an independent knitwear designer who also likes to make videos here on my YouTube channel, Watch Barbara Knit. Make sure to check in the description notes below the videos where you will find links to all of my online shenanigans, including how to get my patterns to knit up for yourself, how to join the Watch Barbara Knit Facebook group, how to support me on Patreon, and buy my merchandise, the Watch Barbara Knit knitting kitties. So today I am actually answering a question out of the comments. First, I want to say I really appreciate it when y'all leave comments and interact with me based on what you've gotten out of my videos. And I try my very best to read and respond to as many as possible. But on my recent Fave 5 hat video, there was a question that someone had that really was... There was too much for me to respond. There was just too much to type because it's really a whole can of worms kind of situation. But I want to make it clear that this is something I probably should have talked about before. It's something I'm kind of passionate about, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have this question to respond to really say a lot of these things. So, Celeste, thank you so much for asking this question, and please don't take anything I say as being in any way critical of the fact that you've asked this question or that you have concerns about the situation, because a lot of this is going to be a little bit of behind the scenes designer kind of stuff. So here's the question. And what Celeste observed is the Mellifera hat is almost identical to the Purlaway hat from September of 2010, which she made 2 of in 2019. So that makes total sense that you would immediately look at the hat when I presented it and go, wow, that looks an awful lot like one I made in the past. And her question was, maybe it's considered a problem because the 2 suggested yarns for the Purlaway hat have been discontinued. And I'm glad you like the Frost Flower hat. So this brings up a couple of things that I want to address. And the fact is, it is not uncommon at all for designers to arrive at similar patterns. A lot of times designing of a pattern is trying to find a solution to a problem or cater to how a yarn looks and functions, and that designers would arrive at similar conclusions is really not a surprise. And there's no reason to think that there's anything malicious or nefarious going on there, because the fact is, the odds that the designer designing the Mellifera hat in 2022 has even seen the 2010 pattern is very, very low. I mean, it's very low that designer even knows that other pattern exists, and we'll talk more about that later, about why that is. But I wanted to talk about the design process. What I was talking about, yarn considerations, solutions, and everything. Designers, and I'm not saying this is completely universal, but a whole lot of the design process involves stitch dictionaries. Okay, I just grabbed a couple off my shelf. All of these up here are stitch dictionaries. All of them over here are stitch dictionaries. Some of them under here are stitch dictionaries, and there's some directly behind me. They're all stitch dictionaries. And what a stitch dictionary is precisely that, a dictionary of stitches. There are no patterns in here. There are no instructions on how to make a specific garment. It is literally just page after page after page of the written instructions on how to knit that particular combination of knits, purls, slips, increases, decreases, cables, twisted stitches, color work, any number of things. And you can see as I'm flipping by, I have bookmarked a lot of these. Here's another one of my personal favorites. These are the Barbara Walkers. And so this type of Stitch Dictionary. The Barbara Walkers, I have Japanese Stitch Dictionaries, I have German Stitch Dictionaries, I have Vogue Stitch Dictionaries, I have all kinds of Stitch Dictionaries. And when you go to attack the design process, a lot of times what you're doing is going to these reference books and going through them and looking for things that are going to work with the yarn you're trying to design with. Or you might not even have a yarn in mind. You're just looking through them for inspiration. And that's what they're there for. And I'm not saying that there's nothing wrong, because this is what designers do, is they take a stitch pattern out of one of these books and they're there to be designed with. And you take them and you swatch them in your yarn and you figure out how many stitches per inch you have and how many rows per inch you have. And you then customize that stitch pattern to work with the yarn that you have. It may work exactly as written out of the Stitch Dictionary. You might have to make some modifications to it, or what happens a lot for me is I'll take a little bit from one stitch pattern, a little bit from another stitch pattern, kind of mash them together, modify, add it to get it to fit into a repeat that I have for the shaping. I might add like a column of pearls to separate things. It's just, it's part of the design process. And what it happens is that a lot of designers have a lot of the same reference materials. So it's not uncommon for someone to take a stitch out of one of these dictionaries and look at it and immediately be like, that would look great in this particular thing. The hat, I'm going to put a link to the Fave 5 and you can go watch it. I'd rather not, because of what we're discussing, I'd rather not show the picture of either of the hats in question, but you can go to the Fave 5 video and you can see it for yourself. It is a 2-color hat that involves a solid cream color and a long color change, and it works particularly well in the slip stitch pattern, and it is definitely one of those totally understandable that different designers would look at that stitch and go, this would look really cool in this yarn, because it really does. Now, when Celeste made her comment, I went and looked at the two patterns, and yes, they are very similar, but they are different. And understanding that they are different is one thing you really need to look at before you start going down any path about thinking that there might be some sort of infringement involved, which we'll talk about in a minute. The primary difference, as soon as I compared the two hats side by side, is that one of them has a ribbed brim and one of them has a garter stitch brim, which functionally and visually are two very different things. The other thing is that one of them is in, let me double check, one of them is an Aran weight yarn and one of them is a worsted weight yarn. So they're not interchangeable, because you have to do their swatches and you have to determine, you know, how many stitches, and the repeats are going to be different, etc., 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 because they're different weight yarns. So they are different patterns. They produce a very similar result, but they're different patterns. And I want to address one thing before anyone says in the comments, well, you only have to change 5% for it to be different. There is no magical percentage that you have to change for it to be a different pattern. That doesn't exist. Not in the knitting world, not in the crochet world. That's not a thing, because you cannot copyright a design at all. You can copyright the instructions for the design, but the physical appearance of the design cannot be copyrighted in the United States. It is a useful object. And I will link to my video that is your knitting pattern illegal?, where I talk more in depth about copyright. And I don't really want to get into that. But the thing is, if you go on Ravelry and you search, you will find literally dozens of patterns for what is essentially a garter stitch scarf. Nobody owns garter stitch. And it's okay. If someone wants to publish a pattern for a garter stitch scarf and someone wants to purchase that pattern, then that is fine. They're not infringing upon anyone else's design. Because, as I said, these stitch, nobody owns, in the same way that you can't copyright the appearance of a finished design, you can't copyright stitch patterns. Everybody has access to these. Now, there have been situations where a very, very popular designer has selected a unique appearing stitch pattern out of a stitch dictionary and highlighted it very visibly in a very visible pattern. And unfortunately, that very popular designer's fans then will attack other designers for stealing that motif. Nobody owns a motif. And you can almost always go back and find instances of designers using that exact same stitch pattern in years previous, just like we have in this situation where we have these two hats that look very, very similar. And there's nothing wrong with that. Now, I said I would talk about how the odds of the 2022 designer having ever seen the 2010 design is very, very low. If you go on Ravelry, and I have it pulled up over here, if you go on Ravelry and you look at the pattern database, and not all patterns are on Ravelry, but it is the largest collection of patterns as far as I know, there are, in just knitting, not knitting and crochet, just knitting, there are 697,387 patterns on Ravelry that you could go look at right now. Literally hundreds of thousands of patterns. If you click the little button for hats and narrow that just to hats, there are 95,413 hat patterns on Ravelry, knitted hat patterns. Now, as a designer, you are not going to look through all those patterns to make sure your idea hasn't been used already. There's nothing saying that you should do that. If you have an idea, if you look at a stitch dictionary, if you have yarn, if you have an idea, if you create it from your brain and using inspiration and knit it and write the pattern yourself and publish that pattern, that's your pattern. The fact that it looks like someone else's pattern, it's very, very difficult to believe or imply that they're knocking off someone else's. Because, so, okay, we've got our 95,413 hat matches. Now, if I were designing a hat and was like, you know what, I want to look through Ravelry and just make sure nobody else has really gotten this idea, because it's a fairly simple stitch pattern. So the first thing I would do is go in here and click the sort button. Since I'm designing in worsted weight yarn, I would click worsted, and that narrows it down to 20,652 hats that I would have to look through. So then I would like go, okay, this is a colorwork hat. So I would narrow it down to colorwork, and I would drill down and until I got all of the attributes that what I was thinking about designing was, and then I would look through them, but probably only the first 10 or 15 pages sorted by popularity, just to get a brief idea. And even if this 2022 designer did that, they would not have seen this pattern because it's designed in a different yarn weight. It's a different pattern. They look very, very similar, but it's a different pattern designed for a different yarn to produce very similar results. So you will come across patterns that look very similar. I have actually been accused in social media of knocking off a very popular designer's pattern. And I was horrified because I didn't. It was just an idea I came up with. It was a very simple idea, but it was an idea. And then I went and I looked at the pattern that I supposedly knocked off, which I had never seen before. And I looked at it, and when viewed from the right side in the photograph, yes, there were very distinct similarities. But just a cursory look at the pictures showed that there were differences. The motif I used ran all the way to the bottom. They started with something else. My pattern was completely reversible. Theirs wasn't. They were visually had similar appearances, but the structure of it and how it was written was completely different. And even if there weren't those differences, even if they looked visually exactly the same, I didn't knock it off, and I wrote the pattern in my own voice. And sometimes people like certain designers' voices and don't like other designers' voices because everybody communicates in a different way, right? And you might be able to follow one designer's pattern because that designer's language and that designer's communication clicks with your understanding. Whereas a pattern that produces visually the exact same piece, if that designer has a drastically different pattern writing style, it might not click with you at all. You might not be able to make heads nor tails of the pattern, which is why, in my opinion, it's fine to have patterns that really produce very similar results, because one might appeal to one learning style and one might appeal to a different learning style. Or maybe one of the designers offers a wide range of accessible patterns in that one of them is chart only and the other one is available that it's already prepped for e-readers or something like that. It's all written out. There's so many different elements moving at the same time. So Celeste, I really appreciate that you asked this question to give me the opportunity to talk. I'm checking my timer to see how long, because I could talk about this for a long time, but I appreciate that you gave me the opportunity to talk about this because yes, you are right. The two hats visually incredibly similar. There are minor stylistic differences. They do definitely use different weight yarns. And as you pointed out, the previous yarn was discontinued, but they do have different brims and it just happens. Convergent design, it's just that particular yarn, the multicolor yarn with that particular stitch pattern is a yes. It's like, this is going to look great together. And it's not surprising that two designers came up with the same idea, but there's nothing nefarious or malicious about it. And frankly, if you actually started and went through and took out the hat and did a Ravelry search with slip stitch and two colors and started really looking through it, you could find a myriad of other patterns that use that particular stitch pattern in that kind of using a solid with a variegated yarn. It's just, it really lends itself towards that technique and that design. They're both cute hats. You might find that one of them works better for you because of the way the pattern is written, but there's nothing negative that I can say about either of the designers. Obviously, one designer came up with it long before the other designer, but who knows? The designer who published in, let me check something. So the designer who published this in 2022, one of the things I try to do is find new designers for y'all. I'm going to go and see their very first pattern was published in 2019. So 9 years. It is possible that this designer didn't even knit in 2010. I learned how to knit in 2010. There's no reason she ever saw this hat, and there's no reason to believe that she might have seen this hat and decided she was going to reproduce it, because she just designed what was in her heart and with using the resources that she had at hand. So now, I am not saying that nobody ever knocks anything off, because people do. And sometimes it is very, very obvious. I have seen it happen with very, very distinctive designs. I will say that the times I have seen it happen, it's a yarn company commissioning a non-named designer or their in-house design to knock off a very popular pattern and then to offer it to sell their yarn Frequently, it's not even going to be credited to a designer. It'll be credited to the in-house design team. And that is nefarious. That is malicious. But it is still not illegal. It is, as long as that design team, whoever is writing the pattern, writes it in their own words, there's nothing the designer can do about it. So when I do design something new, I will do a cursory look through patterns on Ravelry to make sure I'm not reproducing. The very first time I decided to, I thought, hey, I could design a sock. What it was is I was looking through a stitch dictionary and I saw a pattern. I was like, that pattern is really cute. It would make a really cute sock. I'm going to do this. And I started swatching. Then I went, wait a minute, let me go look. And I actually looked at socks and it popped up on the first page. And I was like, oh, Cookie A has already designed a sock with this stitch pattern. I don't think I will, because that's my reputation. And I don't want anyone to think that I am knocking off one of the most popular sock designers there is. So for my own personal reputation and my own personal feelings of integrity, I will do a search. But again, it's going to be in my same yarn weight. It's going to be narrowing it down. And I'm only going to spend maybe a half an hour looking through pages. Because you can get thousands and thousands of results. So with that information, if you are a designer, I would love to hear from you in the comments if you do try to look and see if your idea has been done before. Because I only do that if it's like a relatively simple design, because complex designs can have convergence. It's really kind of fun. So as I said, I could talk about this for a long time. I hope that this video has given you a little bit to think about, and I expect that I'm going to get a lot of opinions in the comments. And even if you disagree with me, that's fine. I would love to hear your opinion, and stimulating discussion is always fun. Now note that next week is the last Thursday of the month. So we will be having the YouTube live at 7 p.m. So if you want to consider and really tell me what you think about this, you can come and continue this conversation during the live at 7 p.m. Eastern time. I hope to see you there, Celeste. I know that you come sometimes. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about this. And please know that I appreciate your participation. And this was in no way, don't feel like I'm in any way like criticizing you for your observation, because it was a very valid observation. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, click that like button. And if you would like to be notified whenever I upload a new video, please subscribe to my channel and select notifications. Thank you so much.